Welcome to this explainer. Okay, think back to the very first time you cracked open a science textbook. If your experience was, anything like mine, you were handed this very specific, incredibly comforting story about how human knowledge grows. We're taught that once upon a time, humanity was basically trapped in darkness. And then these brilliant lone geniuses like Galileo and Newton came along. The story goes that they just gathered facts, step by step, brick by brick, and built this towering skyscraper of modern science. We're taught that science is a straight-line highway, moving strictly in one direction, from total ignorance to absolute truth. It's a beautifully inspiring story, right? Well, there's just one problem. It is absolutely, completely, historically inaccurate.
Okay, let's dive into this. Back in 1962, a physicist turned historian of science named Thomas Kuhn published a book that literally dropped like a nuclear bomb on the academic world. It was called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and man, did it shatter that textbook myth. Kuhn argued that science doesn't actually move in this straight, peaceful line of steady accumulation. No way. Instead, he revealed a reality where science is actually characterized by these long periods of stubborn, dogmatic conformity, which are only occasionally interrupted by chaotic, dramatic, and honestly, deeply irrational intellectual civil wars.
So, to really understand Kuhn's reality, we have to look at the word he practically made famous, paradigm. Now, before it became this watered-down corporate buzzword for like a minor change in marketing strategy, a paradigm meant something incredibly profound. A paradigm is an entire intellectual universe. It's the whole shebang, the complete package of shared beliefs, values, techniques, and assumptions that a scientific community just totally takes for granted. It answers the fundamental questions. What's the world made of? What questions are even legitimate to ask? What actually counts as evidence? And on a practical level, it's an exemplar. That classic textbook problem that students have to solve over and over again. Kuhn pointed out that scientific education is basically just a form of intellectual indoctrination into this rigid framework. We aren't teaching students to be radical skeptics. We're giving them a paradigm and presenting it as total, settled truth.
Part 1. The Jigsaw Puzzle of Normal Science.
Once a paradigm is firmly established, we enter a phase that is the complete opposite of that myth of constant radical discovery. Kuhn calls this normal science. If you ask a random person on the street, they'll probably tell you scientists are always making radical discoveries, but Kuhn says almost never. Normal science is essentially a strenuous attempt to force nature into the conceptual boxes supplied by professional education. So the absolute crucial point here is that normal science is exactly like putting together a giant 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. You already know what the final picture looks like, right? Because it's printed right there on the box. You know every piece has to fit. If a piece doesn't fit, well, the universe isn't broken, you're just putting it in the wrong spot. Normal science focuses on just 3 things: determining significant facts, matching those facts with the existing theory, and articulating that theory in new areas. It's highly productive, super precise puzzle solving, but it carries a massive built-in blind spot.
Part 2. Glitches in the Matrix, Discovery, and Anomaly.
Because every single paradigm is just a simplified, abstract model of an infinitely complex universe, nature eventually refuses to cooperate. The paradigm inevitably runs into things it simply cannot explain. Kuhn calls these uncomfortable little glitches anomalies. To understand how we humans react to these anomalies, let me ask you, what happens when you look at a red 6 of spades? In this incredibly famous 1949 psychological experiment by Bruner and Postman, subjects were flashed playing cards for just fractions of a second. But mixed into the normal deck were anomalous cards like a red 6 of spades. Fascinatingly, the human brain literally refused to see the anomaly. People looked right at it and instantly identified it as either a normal black 6 of spades or a red 6 of hearts. Their brains unconsciously forced that strange visual input right into their existing conceptual boxes. And Kuhn argues that scientists do the exact same thing when they're faced with an anomaly. Take William Herschel. When he observed Uranus in 1781, his telescope clearly showed a faint disk. But he didn't announce a new planet. Why? Because the reigning paradigm of his day dictated that the number of planets was fixed. His conceptual box just did not permit new planets, so he called it an unusual comet. Just like in the playing card experiment, scientists initially just ignore anomalies, or they invent these clever ad hoc patches to protect their worldview, rather than, throwing away their textbooks. Part 3. The Anatomy of a Crisis. Now, most of the time, those clever little patches actually work, but occasionally an anomaly emerges that stubbornly refuses to die. It resists every single patch and starts attacking the paradigm's most sacred assumptions. Think of the wildly complex epicycles of Ptolemaic astronomy, where astronomers just kept adding circles upon circles upon circles just to make the math work for a stationary Earth. When a paradigm reaches this breaking point, the whole field enters a crisis. Now, what's really interesting about this is that you can actually hear the sheer raw despair of this phase in the words of Wolfgang Pauli, one of the greatest quantum physicists of the 20th century. During the crisis of early quantum mechanics in the 1920s, he wrote to a friend, "At the moment, physics is again terribly confused. I wish I had been a movie comedian or something of the sort and had never heard of physics." When a paradigm fails, it's not just a math problem, guys. It's a total breakdown of reality. Scientists whose entire careers were built on the old framework feel the ground literally slipping out from beneath their feet. That unified consensus, it dissolves into a fractured community arguing over fundamental philosophy. Part 4. The Anatomy of a Revolution. So, an absolutely essential rule of scientific history is that you cannot overthrow a paradigm with facts alone. Never happens. A paradigm is only rejected when the field is in an undeniable crisis and a viable alternative is waiting in the wings. This triggers a structural transformation that Kuhn compares to the duck-rabbit optical illusion. It's a gestalt switch. And this brilliantly illustrates the concept. Aristotle looked at a heavy stone swinging on a string and saw a constrained object struggling to reach its natural resting place at the center of the Earth. Galileo looked at the exact same physical stone and saw a pendulum exhibiting periodic motion. The physical object didn't change, just like the ink on the duck-rabbit drawing doesn't change. But the entire intellectual universe flipped instantaneously. You literally can't see both at the same time. We see this structural flip incredibly vividly during the chemical revolution. For a whole century, the absolute smartest minds believed that burning wood released this invisible fire element called phlogiston. But when they heated certain metals, the residue actually weighed more. How on earth could a substance lose phlogiston and get heavier? Some people actually argued that phlogiston had negative weight. I mean, talk about a patch. Then Antoine Lavoisier performed a gestalt switch. He looked at the exact same experiment and asked, what if the metal isn't releasing anything? What if it's absorbing a gas from the air? He called it oxygen. Lavoisier didn't just discover oxygen, he wiped the entire language of chemistry clean. Concepts like combustion and air were totally rewritten. He restructured the entire architecture of the science from the ground up.
And that brings us to Kuhn's most scandalous claim of all, incommensurability. It's a big word, but it essentially means that rival paradigms cannot be directly, objectively compared. Why? Because there is no pure neutral observation. Every single observation you make is already filtered by your theoretical framework. Plus, rival paradigms will use the exact same words but mean completely different things. When Newton says mass, he means a fixed, permanent property. But when Einstein says mass, he means something equivalent to energy that actually changes with velocity. They are literally talking past each other. You cannot convert someone to a new paradigm using cold logic alone. It just doesn't work. Because there's no neutral, logical algorithm to force a scientist to switch paradigms, the transition is actually a lot closer to a religious conversion. Sometimes a new truth only wins because the old generation literally dies off. As the quantum pioneer Max Planck so famously, and somewhat darkly, noted, a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents, but rather because its opponents eventually die. Science advances one funeral at a time. So if this chaotic, human, highly discontinuous reality is how science actually works, why do we all still believe the straight-line myth? Well, because textbooks act like a ministry of truth. After a revolution wins, the victors write the textbooks to train the next generation of students as efficiently as possible. Out of sheer pedagogical necessity, they strip away all the centuries of confusion, the bitter rivalries, the philosophical debates. They basically pluck historical figures completely out of context and make it look like Lavoisier was just looking for oxygen all along. They systematically rewrite history, making those messy scientific revolutions totally invisible, and leaving us with that clean, heroic illusion we talked about at the start. This whole thing forces us to ask a massive, kinda uncomfortable question. Does science actually progress toward an absolute, objective truth about reality? Well, Kuhn says no, and he uses Darwinian evolution to explain why. See, before Darwin, people thought evolution was teleological, like a ladder moving upwards toward a predetermined goal of perfection. But Darwin showed that evolution is just growth pushed from behind by immediate environments. A bird's wing evolves to escape a predator today, not to reach the heavens tomorrow. Kuhn argues that scientific progress is exactly the same thing. We aren't climbing a mountain towards some God's eye view of objective truth. We are simply adapting.
We're shifting from one framework to another, just trying to solve the urgent, immediate puzzles of our time.
Let's move on and see how this builds into part 5, your personal paradigm shift. Kuhn's ideas strike a nerve that reaches way beyond the physics lab. Think about it. Every single one of us filters our politics, our careers, and our relationships through our own personal paradigms. When life throws anomalies at you, maybe it's a financial failure, a betrayal, or even just a piece of news that contradicts your political tribe, your very first instinct is to patch it. You ignore it, or you tell yourself, oh, well, that was just bad luck. We do this because living in a state of crisis is psychologically terrifying. But real personal growth requires walking through this exact mechanical breakdown. When those anomalies accumulate and the patches just stop working, you have to endure the anxiety of a crisis. You have to experience that gestalt switch, looking at your past not as a string of bad luck, but as a broken paradigm. Only then can you rebuild their worldview through a true personal revolution.
Recognizing this cycle gives us incredible humility. It reminds us that our current beliefs are not the final absolute truth of the universe. They're simply the most useful models we've managed to discover so far. So the next time you find yourself stuck on a problem, whether it's in your work or your personal life, stop trying to force stubborn pieces into a broken jigsaw puzzle box. Look really closely at those anomalies you've been trying so hard to ignore. Acknowledge that red six of spades in your own life and ask yourself, is it finally time to shift your paradigm?
Please like and subscribe.